So this is Love, Chapter 7. Announcing the Crown Prince Charles Maximilian Alexander, son of King George Louis Philippe III, noble prince and beloved heir to the throne of Aurelius. Charles usually would have waited for the royal crier to finish declaring his entrance, but this morning he barely even heard the man. He stormed into the royal dining chamber. Inside, he found his father calmly breaking his fast with a plate of almond cakes, freshly baked pastries, and raspberry jam, and the Grand Duke reading aloud from a scroll. "This is 123 households, sire," declared Ferdinand. "None of the maidens came close to fitting the slipper. At this rate, I suspect the search is futile and that the missing young lady will not be found." The Duke lowered his scroll, noticing Charles. "Why, good morning, your Highness." A flurry of servants trailed Charles. Any other day he might have felt horrible about causing a ruckus with this unexpected appearance at breakfast, but not today. King George brightened at the sight of his son. "Good morning, my boy. Sit down, sit down." "Good morning, father," replied the prince, managing an awkward bow. A servant hastily pulled out a chair for him, but he did not sit. Instead, he directed his gaze to the Grand Duke. "I thought I made it clear that I wished to be present for every report regarding the glass slipper." "It is 7:30, your Highness," replied the Duke smoothly. "We waited as long as we could." As always, Ferdinand had an excuse for everything, but Charles detected an undertone of fatigue behind his usual unflappable charm. Dark circles hooded the Grand Duke's eyes, and his uniform, typically pressed to perfection, was wrinkled at the hems. Evidently, he had not slept well. Charles had not either. In truth, he hadn't slept at all. How could he? The last thing he had wanted was for Ferdinand to find his intended bride. Charles had wanted to search for himself. Unfortunately, his father had insisted on appointing the Grand Duke for the job. "Ferdinand is the most capable man in the kingdom. He will find her," he'd said. Her. Charles hated that he didn't even know her name. Everyone was calling her the mysterious maiden, or the runaway princess, or simply the girl with the glass slippers. To him, she'd been more. The girl who had captured his heart. His true love, perhaps. Until he saw her again, he couldn't be sure. "Did you find her?" he asked. "I regret not, your Highness." Ferdinand blew his nose into his handkerchief and waved a hand at the servants to disperse. Charles knew the gesture. These were matters of state, meant only for the sovereign's ears, which meant there was bad news to come. The Duke straightened as the staff retreated outside. "I've searched everywhere. The maiden has vanished." It was as Charles had feared. "Continue your report, please." "As you wish, your Highness." Ferdinand returned to reading his scroll. "From dawn to dusk, 123 households were searched yesterday in the first and second precincts of Valours. None were residents to the maiden with the glass slipper. I regret I must conclude my search." "After only one day?" interrupted Charles. "Yes, I made a thorough inquiry of the first and second precincts. There are 9 precincts in Valours, more than 123 households. There were only 123 noble households." "I thought I'd made myself clear," Charles said through his teeth. "Every house, noble and common." The Duke frowned. But, your Highness, if the girl's a commoner—" "Every eligible maiden was invited to attend, wasn't she?" Charles said, quoting the invitation. "Then the girl could be anyone. A countess, a farmer, a scullery maid. Search everyone." "I am afraid that would be impossible," said the Duke. "There is a council meeting this morning regarding urgent matters of state. My presence is not to be missed. Sire, don't you agree?" Said the king, who was more focused on his plate of eggs than on the conversation at hand. "Ah, yes, urgent matters of state. Everyone's been searched." "He seems distracted this morning," Charles thought, observing his father. "No, I said to search everyone. If I could go myself to look for her—" "That's out of the question," interrupted Ferdinand. "Your Highness, it would be neither appropriate nor safe for you to venture into Valours on such a quest." "I was addressing my father, not you." Ferdinand's right, said the king, finally snapping to attention. A prince does not go out on a manhunt, knocking on doors in search of a runaway princess. It's not a... Besides, your Aunt Genevieve arrived this morning and expects you to accompany her to lunch. The prince started. The name was one he hadn't heard in years. Aunt Genevieve is here? That's what I said, isn't it? A muscle twitched in Charles's jaw. Now he understood why his father looked so preoccupied. His aunt, the Duchess of Orleans, hadn't visited in nearly a decade. In fact, the last time she'd been there, she'd sworn never to return to the palace. She and his father famously did not get along, and Charles didn't understand why, given he thought the world of her. Where is she now? Charles asked. Still sleeping, I should hope. King George shoveled the rest of his pastry into his mouth. He began to cough violently as he chewed, the color draining from his face. Oh dear! Exclaimed the Grand Duke, springing to action. He tapped the king's back with his scroll, but it only made the coughing worse. By now, the king's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. Charles rounded on his father, hoisting him out of his chair and pumping his chest as the Duke rang the nearest bell. Come help! His Majesty is choking! Just as the servants began clamoring inside, the pastry shot out of his mouth onto the table. Breathe, father, breathe! The king tugged at his collar, recovering his breath. Sire, said the Duke, that's the third time this week. Are you... King George grunted, a signal for the Duke to be quiet. Nothing's the matter with me. Drank my tea too fast, that's all. Pass me the sugar, will you? Father, are you sure that's a good idea? You just choked. The Duke complied before Charles could argue further, scooping a heaping spoonful for the king. George leaned back in his chair, a contented smile cheering his expression. Perhaps you ought to sit out on meeting with the council this morning, Your Majesty, Ferdinand said, once Charles's father took another long sip. The Duke had taken the tone Charles detested most. It was far too nice, far too suggestive that he was angling for something. But what? Sit out the meeting? Yes, the physician said. The king shot the Grand Duke a deadly look. I can handle a council meeting, thank you very much. But sire, Charles frowned at both of them. What did the physician say, father? Only that all this party-throwing business is too much for a young man like me. King George leaned back in his chair, exhaling, then letting out a chortle. What does he know? The Grand Duke was watching them, a corner of his mouth lifted. Charles didn't like that look. Shouldn't you be resuming your search in Valors? He asked Ferdinand. If your highness insists, I will certainly continue my search, but only after the council meeting. There are important laws being discussed this morning, and His Majesty greatly values my opinion. Charles frowned. Important laws? Father, I could help you. No, you must not be late for your luncheon with the Duchess, interrupted Ferdinand smoothly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must prepare my statement for today's council. He rolled up his scroll, tucking it under his arm, saluted the king, and bowed. Then the door closed, leaving the prince alone with his father. Charles opened his mouth to express his doubts about the Grand Duke, but his father spoke first. Why the frown, my boy? Don't be so hard on Ferdinand. He's doing the best job he can. I don't trust him. Why not? He's doing you a great favor, searching the kingdom for the girl with the glass slipper. Charles tried not to cringe. The last person he wanted to be indebted to was the Duke. Curious maiden, this young lady of yours, the king laughed heartily. I've heard of many things in my time, but not glass slippers. Cheer up, my boy, we'll find her. How far could she have gotten on glass? And only one shoe. Slowly Charles relaxed, and he couldn't help smiling. Hearing his father laugh reminded him of the man he'd missed while he was away at the Royal University. The vibrant and energetic father who'd bounced him on his knee when he was a boy and spent every precious free moment he had with his son. Then the king's shoulders sagged, and his laugh became a dry, hacking cough. Panic seized Charles. Father! King George clutched his chest, pounding on it with his fists. His cough spluttered into a coarse wheeze. Then he forced a laugh. It's nothing, my boy. He waved a croissant at Charles, then picked up his teacup again. Just choked on my good humor. That didn't sound like you were choking. Lord knows I won't have anything to laugh about when Genevieve's around, interjected the king dryly. The last time your aunt smiled, I still had all my hair. He patted his bald scalp. Why else do you think I sent her away? She's no good for my blood pressure, no good for my sleep either. But his father hadn't sent her away. From what Charles remembered, Aunt Genevieve had chosen to leave. He didn't know much more than that. It was always a sore subject with his father, one he had never dared to broach himself. Now, are you going to keep standing there, or are you going to join me for breakfast? Some other time, said Charles. He had a feeling his father was simply trying to change the subject. The king harumphed. Very well, then. Be sure you arrive on time for lunch. The last thing I need is Genevieve haranguing me for not teaching you proper manners. I'll be there. Charles started to leave, then paused in his step, tensing. What is it, my boy? It's a matter of the council, said Charles. I'd like to join your daily meetings with Ferdinand, too. Ah, the king's voice drifted. He'd coughed into his sleeve. Naturally you will, Charles, in due time. Let us focus on getting you settled back in the palace. I am settled. Then let's wait until Ferdinand finds your girl, and then we'll talk, all right? Best for you to have a proper introduction to the council once that is sorted. The king leaned back against his chair's cushioned headboard. You'll be happier, too. Very well, father, the prince bowed. Enjoy your breakfast. On his way out, Charles noticed his father's chamberlain lingering outside the door. Keeping his voice low, the prince said, Sir Chamberlain, would you have the royal physician visit my father again today? The older man blinked as if surprised by the question, but befitting the truly trained and skilled servant he was, he quickly hid his confusion and bent his head. Yes, your highness. Thank you, Sir Chamberlain. Feeling slightly better about his father's health, Charles strolled on, but he didn't know where he was going. The gardens, perhaps? He had spent almost all of the day before there trying to retrace the steps he'd taken with her, to see if he could remember anything that might help him find her. He hadn't, but maybe today would be different. It was better than waiting for Ferdinand to come back with the news. 3 corridors down, Charles passed the physician, hurrying to the king's chamber. That was quick, he murmured. Dr. Coast, are you on the way to see my father? Why, yes, your highness. The physician shuffled backward, and a flash of parchment peeked out from under his arm, stamped with Ferdinand's seal. Curious. What did Ferdinand want with the royal physician? I am concerned about his health. Was he ill much while I was away? His Majesty the King is in excellent health, Dr. Coast replied, a little too brightly. His appetite is vigorous and his energy boundless. I have recommended that he exercise more, perhaps a daily morning walk about the gardens, but His Majesty has been so excited for your Highness's return from the Royal University this month that he has not yet implemented my suggestion. Even still, there is nothing to be concerned about. Are you certain? His cough sounded worrisome. It's happened before, the physician assured him. Likely His Majesty is simply growing more sensitive to things like dust. Not unusual for a man of his age. That and his blood pressure is slightly elevated, but it's nothing a good week of rest can't fix. Think nothing of it. I see, Charles replied. That was what his father had said. Well, if there's anything you can do, Dr. Coast stroked his beard. I know the Grand Duke enjoys visiting His Majesty after the evening council meetings, but I would suggest that your father not take any tea after dinner. A better night's rest would relieve his coughing fits. I'll propose a sleeping draught instead. That eased some of Charles's concern. Thank you, Dr. Coast. Carry on. Unclenching his fist, the prince headed to the stables. He might not be allowed to leave the palace to help search for the girl of his dreams, but a brisk ride through the royal grounds would help clear his mind, even if just for a few hours.